The lawyer looked at me over his glasses, adjusted the papers in front of him, and said 7 words I will never forget. "Your father left you absolutely nothing, Miss Carter." The room was completely silent. My stepmother sat across from me with her hands folded neatly in her lap. My stepbrother Tyler was already smiling. I sat completely still. I did not cry. I did not argue. Because something felt wrong. Not emotionally wrong. Practically wrong. My father was a methodical man, a precise man. A man who color-coded his filing cabinet and never missed a single bill payment in 40 years. Men like that do not forget things. Men like that do not leave things incomplete. And then, the lawyer cleared his throat. He reached into a separate folder. A brown envelope I had not noticed before. He slid it slowly across the table directly toward me. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and quietly left the room. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, if stories like this stay with you, hit subscribe right now. Every week I share stories about family, justice, and the truth that always finds a way out. You will not want to miss what comes next. My name is Rebecca Carter. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And for most of my life, I believed that family meant safety. It took my father's death to teach me how wrong I was. My father, Robert Carter, was a self-made man. He grew up with nothing. Built a small commercial real estate business from the ground up starting in his late 20s. Nothing flashy. Nothing that made the news. Just 30 years of quiet, disciplined, unglamorous work. By the time I was in high school, we were comfortable. Not wealthy by Nashville standards, but stable, secure, safe. My father valued 3 things above everything else: hard work, honesty, and loyalty. He used to say, "Rebecca, the truth always has a longer memory than the lie." I wrote that down in my journal when I was 16. I still have that journal. My mother passed away when I was 12. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to gone. My father grieved quietly and completely. For 3 years, it was just the 2 of us. Then he met Sandra. Sandra Michaels, 51 years old, twice divorced. 1 son from her first marriage, Tyler, who was 26 when they married. My father was happy with her, and I wanted him to be happy. So I smiled at family dinners. I welcomed Tyler at Thanksgiving. I sent Sandra birthday cards every year without fail. What I could not do was pretend I didn't notice the small things. The way Sandra redirected conversations about my father's business. The way Tyler started showing up at my father's office just to help out. The way certain financial documents started appearing on the kitchen counter that my father would quietly fold away when I walked in. I noticed. I said nothing, because my father seemed content, and I loved him too much to make his final years uncomfortable. He was diagnosed with early onset dementia in the spring of 2021. The decline was faster than any of us expected. Within 8 months, he needed full-time care. Sandra managed everything. The doctors, the medications, the finances. I visited every single weekend. Every single one. I sat with him, read to him, showed him old photographs. Some weekends, he knew exactly who I was. Some weekends, he looked at me like a kind stranger he was trying to place. Those were the hardest days. Sandra was always polite during my visits, but there was something underneath the politeness. A subtle management, a careful control of what he saw, what he heard, who came in and for how long. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief makes you suspicious of everything. I kept visiting, I kept smiling, I kept showing up. My father passed on a Tuesday morning in February. I was 40 minutes away when Sandra called. I drove those 40 minutes in complete silence. When I arrived, Tyler was already there, already on his phone, already making calls. That's when everything changed. 3 weeks after the funeral, we were called to the office of my father's attorney, Gerald Marsh, 20-year family lawyer, a quiet man with sharp eyes. I sat on one side of the conference table. Sandra and Tyler sat on the other. Gerald began the reading methodically. The house to Sandra, that made sense. They had been married for 9 years. The investment accounts split between Sandra and Tyler. The business transferred to Tyler 18 months prior via a document my father had apparently signed. 18 months prior, when the dementia had already begun. I sat very still. Gerald continued. Personal property, vehicle, remaining savings, all directed away from me. All of it. When he finished reading, he looked up. Sandra had a small, careful smile. Tyler was already looking at his phone again. And Gerald Marsh looked directly at me and said, Miss Carter, your father left you absolutely nothing. The words sat in the room like something heavy. I looked at my hands. I thought about my father color-coding his filing cabinet. I thought about him teaching me to balance a checkbook at age 10. I thought about him saying, the truth always has a longer memory than the lie. And something inside me became very, very quiet. Not defeated quiet, strategic quiet. But what nobody in that room knew was, my father had called me 7 months before he passed. One of his clear days. He had asked me to come alone. No Sandra, no Tyler, just us. I drove to the house on a Saturday morning and found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He reached across the table and held both my hands. And he said, Becca, I need you to trust me. Not right now, but later. Can you do that? I said, yes. He nodded slowly. Then he said, Gerald knows what to do. That was all. He never mentioned it again. On his clearer days after that, I waited for him to bring it up. He never did, and I had almost convinced myself it was a confused moment, until Gerald Marsh slid that brown envelope across the table and left the room. I sat alone in that conference room for a moment. Sandra and Tyler had already followed Gerald out, assuming I supposed that there was nothing left worth staying for. I picked up the envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. His real handwriting. The precise architectural print he had used my entire life. Not shaky. Not uncertain. Deliberate. I opened it carefully. Inside were 3 things. The first was a handwritten letter, 4 pages. Both sides. The second was a document. I did not immediately understand, a legal filing referencing something called a revocable living trust. The third was a business card. A different attorney, a woman named Catherine Howell, elder law and estate litigation specialist. Austin, Texas. At the bottom of the business card in my father's handwriting, she already knows everything. Call her Monday. I love you, Becca. I sat in that room for a long time. Then I put everything back in the envelope. Put the envelope in my bag. Walked out past reception where Sandra was talking to Gerald and Tyler was on his phone. I smiled at all 3 of them. And I walked to my car. I called Catherine Howell that Monday morning at 8 a.m. She picked up on the second ring. She said, Miss Carter, I've been expecting your call. Over the next 2 weeks, Catherine walked me through everything my father had done. 18 months before he passed, before the dementia had progressed, he had worked quietly and privately with Catherine to establish a revocable living trust, completely separate from the will that Sandra and Tyler believed was the only document that existed. Inside that trust, the original business, not the shell company Tyler had been given, the actual operating business with all its real assets and contracts. A separate investment portfolio my father had been building quietly for 12 years that Sandra did not know existed. The family lake house in Hendersonville that my mother had loved, the one Sandra had told me was sold years ago. It had never been sold. It was in the trust. For me, my father had also included a detailed personal letter to Catherine documenting specific concerns about undue financial influence during his illness. That letter became the foundation of a formal legal complaint filed with the Tennessee Adult Protective Services. The investigation took 4 months. Catherine was precise and thorough and completely relentless. What they found was a pattern of financial manipulation beginning shortly after my father's diagnosis. Documents signed during periods of documented cognitive decline. Transfers made without proper legal oversight. A will that had been modified twice by an attorney Sandra had hired privately without my father's longtime counsel present. Gerald Marsh, to his credit, cooperated fully with the investigation. He told investigators that my father had come to him privately on one of his clearest days and made him promise to deliver that envelope directly to me and only to me. He had kept that promise. Tyler's transfer of the business was reversed by court order. Sandra contested the trust. She lost. The settlement was finalized on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in Catherine Howell's office in Nashville when it came through. Catherine looked across her desk at me and said simply, "It's done." I drove to the lake house in Hendersonville that evening, the one my mother had loved, the one I had been told was gone. I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the water, and I talked to my father the way I used to when I was small. Out loud, just quietly. Just the two of us. I told him I understood now. I told him the truth did have a longer memory than the lie. I told him I found the envelope. I told him I called Catherine on Monday. And I told him I was going to be okay. Sandra and Tyler are currently facing a separate civil suit. The lake house is mine. The business is being restructured under new management. And I visit Hendersonville every single month. I sit on that same porch. And every single time, I feel my father sitting right there beside me. If someone in your life made you feel forgotten, if you were told there was nothing left for you, hold on. Because sometimes the people who love us most are working quietly on our behalf in ways we cannot yet see. My father did not leave me nothing. My father left me everything. He just made sure it was protected until the right moment, and he trusted me to find it. The truth always has a longer memory than the lie. He was right. He was always right.